The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Burlington's Grand Concert Hall, as Thomas Harrington's fingers danced across the keys of the magnificent Steinway grand piano. The final notes of Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu hung in the air like invisible smoke, fading slowly into silence before the small audience erupted in applause. Thomas stood and bowed with practiced precision, his tall frame dressed in an expensive tailored suit that matched his carefully styled dark hair. At 34, he had the confident posture of someone who knew their worth and expected others to recognize it too. "Brilliant as always, Thomas," said Richard, the concert hall director, approaching with a glass of champagne. "The fall season will open wonderfully with you as our featured soloist." Thomas accepted the drink with a slight nod. "Of course it will. I've been working on a particularly difficult piece that few pianists would even attempt." He took a sip and glanced dismissively at a young woman practicing in the corner. Unlike some who seemed content with mediocrity, Richard followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "Lisa's quite talented, Thomas." "She's young, but she lacks proper technique," Thomas interrupted. "Her rhythm in the third movement was embarrassingly unstable." He spoke loudly enough for others to hear, including Lisa, whose shoulders visibly tensed. A few feet away, Diane Collins, who organized most of the hall's charity events, shook her head. "He gets worse every year," she whispered to her assistant. "Sometimes I wonder if his playing is worth putting up with his attitude." Thomas pretended not to hear as he moved through the room, accepting compliments with the air of someone who found praise entirely expected. The truth was, he had earned his reputation. His technical precision was unmatched in the local music scene, and his background, trained at Juilliard under renowned masters, gave him credentials few could challenge. What people didn't see were the hours he spent alone in his apartment, practicing until his fingers ached, pushing himself toward a perfection that always seemed just beyond reach. His apartment walls were bare except for framed reviews of his performances, and a single photograph of his stern-faced father standing next to a piano. As the small reception ended, Thomas walked home to his building on Maple Street, one of the more expensive addresses in Burlington. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, but Thomas barely noticed, mentally replaying his performance and noting where microseconds could have been improved. He was so lost in thought that he almost collided with someone at the entrance to his building, a woman carrying several boxes, stacked so high she could barely see over them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice slightly strained from the effort. Thomas stepped aside without offering help. "You should be more careful," he said flatly. The woman paused and shifted the boxes to peek around them. She appeared to be in her early 40s with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple style. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. "I'm Elena," she said with a small smile. "Just moved into 3B, looks like we're neighbors." "Thomas Harrington, 4A. He pressed the elevator button and checked his watch. "3B has thin floors. I practice piano several hours daily, so I hope you're not sensitive to noise." Elena's smile didn't waver. "Actually, I love piano music. I play a bit myself," Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Do you, professionally?" "Oh no, just for enjoyment." The elevator arrived and Thomas stepped in. "Well, don't worry about disturbing me with your practice. My apartment is soundproofed." The doors closed before Elena could respond. In the following weeks, Thomas occasionally passed Elena in the hallway or lobby. She always offered a friendly greeting, which he returned with minimal courtesy. He learned from the building manager that she worked at the city library and had moved to Burlington after a divorce. Once or twice, he heard piano music coming from her apartment, simple melodies played with surprising feeling. Nothing technically impressive, he thought, but something about the emotional quality made him pause outside her door longer than he intended. 3 weeks after Elena moved in, Thomas found a flyer in his mailbox for a community center fundraiser featuring local musical performances. Normally, he ignored such amateur events, but he noticed his name printed prominently. Special performance by Thomas Harrington. Pianist. He immediately called Diane Collins, whose name was listed as the contact. "I never agreed to perform at your little charity event," he said when she answered. "Hello to you too, Thomas," Diane replied calmly. "I spoke with Richard, and he thought you might be willing since the fundraiser is to renovate the community center's music room. Many children who can't afford private lessons use that space." Thomas frowned. He had no particular interest in children's music education. but Richard was an important connection for his career. Fine, but I'll play only one piece and I expect a proper piano, not some out-of-tune upright. We're borrowing a baby grand from Henderson's music shop. Will that suffice for one whole piece? The sarcasm in Diane's voice was barely concealed. Thomas ignored it. It will have to do. Put me at the beginning of the program. I have another engagement that evening. He didn't, but he had no intention of sitting through a parade of amateur performances. The evening of the fundraiser arrived, and Thomas dressed with his usual care. The community center was only a 10-minute walk from his apartment building. As he passed Elena's door, he heard her voice speaking to someone inside. Then, to his surprise, she emerged wearing a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Oh, hello," she said, looking equally surprised to see him dressed formally. "Are you heading to the community center fundraiser too?" Thomas nodded stiffly. "I'm performing. That's wonderful. I'm just going to listen. I love discovering local musicians." They walked downstairs together, Elena making pleasant conversation about the beautiful weather and the changing leaves. Thomas responded with brief comments, his mind already on his performance. The community center's main room had been transformed for the evening with string lights and autumn decorations. About 60 chairs faced a small stage where a gleaming baby grand piano waited. The room was already half full when Thomas and Elena arrived. Diane approached immediately. "Thomas, thank you for coming. You're first on the program as requested." She turned to Elena with a warmer smile. "Welcome. I don't think we've met. Elena Russo. I'm new to town." "Elena recently moved into my building," Thomas added, surprising himself by making the introduction. "Lovely to meet you," Diane said. "Please help yourself to refreshments. We're starting in about 15 minutes. Thomas excused himself to examine the piano, testing the keys and adjusting the bench height. The instrument wasn't up to his standards, but it would serve for one piece. As he prepared, he noticed Elena taking a seat in the back row, declining offers to move forward despite several empty chairs near the front. At precisely 7 o'clock, Diane welcomed everyone and introduced Thomas with flattering remarks about his accomplishments. He walked to the piano with confident steps, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys with practiced precision. He had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, technically challenging enough to display his skills, but accessible enough for this audience. As he played, he fell into the familiar trance of performance, his fingers executing each note exactly as he had practiced countless times. When he finished, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Thomas stood, bowed slightly, and returned to his seat in the front row, already planning his exit after a polite amount of time had passed. Diane returned to the microphone. "Thank you, Thomas, for that beautiful performance. Now we have something special planned. As you know, we're raising money to renovate our music room, which serves many community members, especially children. So tonight we're inviting anyone who wishes to play our beautiful piano to make a donation of any amount. Who would like to be first?" Thomas stifled a groan. He hadn't expected to sit through amateur performances. He discreetly checked his watch, calculating how soon he could leave without appearing rude. An elderly man with wispy white hair stood up shakily. "I haven't played in 30 years, he announced with a chuckle, "but I'd like to try if that's all right." The audience clapped encouragingly as he made his way to the piano. Thomas watched with thinly veiled impatience as the man slowly picked out a simple melody, heart and soul, with occasional wrong notes. When he finished, people applauded warmly. The old man beamed as he placed a $20 bill in the donation box. Thomas couldn't help himself. He leaned toward the person next to him and said in a voice louder than he intended, "Charming, but that's what happens when people without proper training think they can play." Several heads turned in his direction, including Elena's from the back row. Her expression was unreadable from that distance, but something about her focused attention made Thomas suddenly aware of how his words had sounded. The old man's smile faltered slightly as he returned to his seat. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room until Diane quickly asked, "Who else would like to play?" From the back of the room, Elena rose quietly from her chair. Elena made her way slowly through the rows of chairs. All eyes followed her progress, including Thomas's, who straightened in his seat with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. He hadn't expected his quiet neighbor to volunteer. Diane smiled warmly. "We have a newcomer to Burlington. "Welcome, Elena." Elena nodded her thanks as she approached the piano. She wore no jewelry except for a simple silver chain with a tiny piano pendant that caught the light as she moved. Her hands, Thomas noticed for the first time, had long, slender fingers, a pianist's hands. She sat at the bench and adjusted it slightly lower than Thomas had positioned it. Then she closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and began to play. The melody that emerged was simple, Erik Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. But from the first notes, something in the room changed. Elena played with a gentleness that made the borrowed piano sound better than it had all evening. Her technique wasn't flashy, but her timing was perfect, and she shaped each phrase with subtle emotion that made the familiar piece sound fresh. Thomas found himself leaning forward slightly. Her playing lacked the technical fireworks he specialized in, but there was something in her interpretation that caught his attention, a quality he couldn't immediately identify. When she finished, the room remained silent for a heartbeat before erupting in applause that seemed louder than what Thomas had received. Elena smiled shyly, stood, and placed a $10 bill in the donation box. "That was lovely," Diane said as Elena turned to return to her seat. "Have you performed professionally?" Elena shook her head. "No, just for myself mostly." Thomas couldn't stop himself. "You have decent basic technique," he said, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "But that piece is elementary. Any first-year piano student could manage it." A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged among the audience members. Elena paused, meeting Thomas's eyes directly for the first time. "Perhaps," she replied quietly. "But music isn't just about difficulty, is it?" Something about her calm response irritated Thomas more than if she had been offended. "Real musical artistry requires mastering challenging pieces," he insisted. "Anyone can play slow, simple melodies." Diane stepped forward quickly. "Well, we appreciate all contributions tonight. Who else would like to play?" But Thomas wasn't finished. He stood up. "I'm simply making the point that there's a difference between casual playing and true musicianship. It's like comparing someone who doodles to a genuine artist." The room had gone uncomfortably silent. Elena remained standing by the piano, her expression thoughtful rather than upset. "Music touches people in different ways," she said. "Technical skill is valuable, but it's not the only measure of musical understanding." Thomas felt a flush of annoyance. Who was this librarian to lecture him about music? He'd spent his life dedicated to perfecting his craft, sacrificing normal relationships and simple pleasures for hours of practice every day. "Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate what you mean," he challenged. "Something more substantial than beginner's repertoire?" Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Diane stepped forward again. "Thomas, this is supposed to be a fun community event." "No, it's all right," Elena said with a small smile. "I'd be happy to play something else." She returned to the piano and this time chose a Bach prelude, still not technically demanding by Thomas's standards, but more complex than the Satie. Again, her playing had that same quality of emotional connection that made the audience lean forward in their seats. When she finished, the applause was even warmer. Thomas found himself annoyed not just by the audience's reaction, but by his own unexpected appreciation of her playing. There was something about her approach that made even this simple Bach piece sound meaningful. He stood up again. "Bach requires precision and clarity," he said, moving toward the piano. "If you don't mind." He gestured for Elena to give up the bench. With a slight nod, she moved aside. Thomas sat down and played the same prelude, but at a slightly faster tempo and with meticulous attention to the counterpoint. His version was technically flawless, every note in place, every run executed with perfect evenness. When he finished, the applause was polite but notably less enthusiastic than it had been for Elena. Thomas caught a few whispered comments. "Incredible technique. But something missing, isn't there?" He stood up abruptly, turning to face Elena. "Technical mastery is the foundation of true artistry. Without it, you're just playing at being a musician." Elena tilted her head slightly. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the piano. Thomas stepped aside with a dismissive wave, certain she was about to embarrass herself by attempting something beyond her abilities. Instead, Elena sat down and played a different Bach piece, the prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Her version wasn't as technically precise as Thomas's might have been, but she brought out inner voices in the music that many pianists overlooked, creating a warm, almost conversational quality. As she played the final chords, Thomas felt a strange twist of emotions, admiration mixed with defensiveness. The audience's enthusiastic response only heightened his discomfort. An interesting interpretation, he said stiffly when she finished, but hardly definitive. Something shifted in Elena's expression, not anger but perhaps disappointment. There is no definitive interpretation, Thomas. That's what makes music alive. Several audience members nodded in agreement. Thomas felt suddenly outnumbered, his position as the evening's musical authority undermined. I think what we have here, he said, raising his voice slightly, is a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes musical excellence. Perhaps we should explore that more fully. Diane stepped between them. This has been a wonderful musical exchange, but we have others waiting to play. I'm proposing a proper demonstration, Thomas continued, ignoring her. A musical evening. Elena and myself each playing 2 pieces of our choice. Let the audience decide whose approach to music they find more compelling. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, "A piano duel." Brilliant. Elena looked surprised. I don't think that's necessary. Afraid your approach won't stand up to scrutiny? Thomas asked. She studied his face for a moment, then shook her head slightly. No, not afraid. I just don't see music as a competition. Then consider it a conversation, he pressed. 2 different perspectives on what makes music meaningful. Diane, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. Actually, that could be a wonderful fundraising event. We could sell tickets with proceeds going to the music room renovation. The audience responded with enthusiastic agreement. Thomas watched Elena's face, expecting her to back down. To his surprise, after a moment's consideration, she nodded. If it helps the community center, I'd be happy to participate. Excellent, Diane said quickly before either could reconsider. We could hold it here next Saturday evening. Each of you will play 2 pieces of your choosing. The audience can make donations toward their preferred performer, and whoever raises the most will be our winner. I think we'll need a bigger venue, someone called out. Everyone in town will want to see this. Thomas felt a surge of confidence. In a proper musical contest, his years of training and technical mastery would surely triumph over Elena's amateur emotionality. I accept those terms, he said. Next Saturday evening. Elena extended her hand. Next Saturday. As Thomas shook her hand, he noticed again the strength and grace in her fingers. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. No one without formal training could possibly match his level of musicianship. The rest of the fundraiser continued with several other community members playing, but the room buzzed with excited conversations about the upcoming piano duel. Thomas stayed longer than he had planned, listening with half an ear to the other performances while observing Elena, who had returned to her seat in the back row and was watching each player with genuine interest. When the event ended, Thomas found himself walking home at the same time as Elena. The autumn night was cool, and their breath made small clouds in the air. I hope I didn't put you in an uncomfortable position, he said, not entirely sincerely. Not at all, Elena replied, though I think you might be disappointed. If you're expecting some kind of dramatic showdown, what I expect is a clear demonstration of the difference between professional musicianship and hobbyist. Playing, Thomas said. No offense intended. Elena smiled faintly in the darkness. None taken. Music means different things to different people. They walked the rest of the way in silence. At their building, Thomas held the door for her, a courtesy he rarely extended to others. As they waited for the elevator, an unexpected question formed in his mind. What made you start playing piano? He asked. Something in Elena's expression softened. My grandmother taught me when I was 5. She said music was a language that could say things words couldn't. The elevator arrived and they stepped inside. What about you? Thomas hesitated. My father believed that excellence was the only acceptable standard. Piano was to be mastered, not merely played. Elena nodded as if his answer explained something she had wondered about. When they reached her floor, she stepped out and turned back to him. Good night, Thomas. I look forward to our musical conversation. As the elevator doors closed, Thomas found himself wondering for the first time in years what his playing would sound like to someone else's ears, not judging its technical merit, but simply experiencing it as music. The thought unsettled him all the way to his apartment door. News of the upcoming piano duel spread through Burlington like wildfire. By Monday morning, Thomas had received 3 calls from local musicians curious about his unusual challenge to the unknown woman. The community center's phone rang constantly with people asking how to get tickets. Thomas woke early and immediately began his practice routine, pushing himself harder than usual. He'd decided on Liszt's La Campanella for his first piece, a dazzling technical showcase that would demonstrate his virtuosity beyond any doubt. For his second piece, he selected Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, with its thunderous chords and lightning-fast passages. He worked through each section methodically, recording himself and listening critically for the slightest flaws. His apartment fell away as he lost himself in practice, not even stopping for lunch. The only interruption came when his phone rang with a call from Richard, the concert hall director. "Thomas, I heard about your little musical showdown," Richard said, amusement evident in his voice. "The entire arts community is talking about it." Thomas frowned. "It's hardly a showdown, more of a demonstration of proper musical standards. Either way, it's created quite a buzz, so much so that we'd like to offer the concert hall as the venue. Diane called me this morning. They've already sold more tickets than the community center can hold." This caught Thomas by surprise. "The concert hall? That seems excessive for a simple fundraiser." "Don't underestimate public interest in a good story, Thomas. The celebrated pianist versus the mysterious newcomer? People love that sort of thing." "She's not mysterious," Thomas replied. "She's a librarian who plays piano as a hobby. Well, whatever she is, half the town wants to see what happens. Saturday at 7 new. We'll have the Steinway tuned specially." After hanging up, Thomas stood at his window looking down at the street below. He hadn't expected such public interest. What had been intended as a simple lesson in musical standards was turning into a significant event. The stakes felt suddenly higher. In the building's small exercise room that evening, Thomas was surprised to find Elena on the treadmill. She wore simple workout clothes and had her hair tied back. She smiled when she saw him. "Hello, Thomas." He nodded in greeting as he began his own workout. "Have you heard? They've moved our event to the concert hall." "Yes, Diane called me," Elena replied, continuing her steady pace on the treadmill. "It seems we've created quite a stir. Have you selected your pieces?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. Elena nodded. "I have." When she didn't elaborate, Thomas found himself unusually irritated by her calm demeanor. "The acoustics at the hall are quite different from the community center. More revealing. Every nuance and every mistake will be clearly audible." "I'm sure it will be lovely," Elena said simply. "I've never performed in such a grand space before." Thomas couldn't help himself. It can be intimidating for those not accustomed to proper performance venues. Elena glanced at him with something that looked almost like pity. "Is winning very important to you, Thomas?" The question caught him off guard. "It's not about winning. It's about upholding standards." Even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "I see," Elena said, her breathing still even despite her exertion. "For me, it's about sharing something meaningful with others. The venue doesn't change that." They exercised in silence for several minutes before Thomas spoke again. "Where did you study piano?" "With my grandmother, as I mentioned. Later, I had a few teachers here and there. No conservatory training?" Elena smiled slightly. "Not the traditional path, no." Thomas wanted to press further, but something in her expression discouraged additional questions. After finishing his workout, he nodded goodbye and left, feeling oddly unsatisfied with their exchange. Back in his apartment, Thomas found himself standing at the wall that separated his unit from Elena's. Very faintly, he could hear her piano. She must have gone directly home to practice. He pressed his ear against the wall, trying to make out what she was playing. The melody was unfamiliar, but even through the barrier, he could sense that same quality in her playing that had caught his attention at the fundraiser, a genuine emotional connection to the music. Thomas stepped back, troubled by his own curiosity. On Wednesday, Thomas decided to visit the library. He told himself it was to find some historical recordings of the pieces he was preparing, but in truth, he hoped to observe Elena in her workplace. The Burlington Public Library was housed in a beautiful old stone building with wide steps leading to its entrance. Inside, Thomas wandered through the stacks until he reached the information desk, where Elena sat helping an elderly woman locate a book. Her manner was patient and warm as she explained the library's organization system. When the woman thanked her profusely for finding a novel she'd been seeking for weeks, Elena's smile reached her eyes in a way that seemed genuine. Thomas pretended to browse nearby shelves until Elena noticed him. "Thomas," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I don't think I've seen you in the library before." "Research," he replied, approaching the desk. "I was looking for some rare recordings. The music collection is on the second floor. I can show you if you'd like." As she led him upstairs, Thomas noticed how many patrons greeted her by name. She seemed to know not just their reading preferences but details about their lives. Asking one man about his wife's recovery from surgery, congratulating a teenage girl on a recent academic achievement. The music section was small but well organized. Elena pointed out several relevant collections. "How long have you worked here?" Thomas asked. "Just 2 months," Elena replied. "Since moving to Burlington, you seem to know everyone already," Elena shrugged. "People tell you things when you listen." She ran her fingers along a row of CDs. "Here's an excellent recording of the list you're preparing." The pianist takes a less aggressive approach than most, lets the notes breathe a bit more. Thomas blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was playing Liszt?" "You were practicing it yesterday afternoon. The walls between our apartments aren't as soundproof as you might think." Thomas felt oddly exposed. The idea that she had been listening to his practice sessions, just as he had tried to listen to hers, was unsettling. "Well," he said stiffly, "I should get back to my practice schedule." "Of course." Elena selected a CD and handed it to him. "Give this recording a try. Sometimes hearing a different interpretation can be illuminating." That evening, against his better judgment, Thomas listened to the CD Elena had recommended. The pianist's approach was indeed different from his own, less focused on speed and technical brilliance, more attentive to the music's architecture and emotional landscape. Thomas found himself playing sections of La Campanella differently afterward, though he would never have admitted it to anyone. By Friday, the piano duel had become the talk of the town. The local newspaper ran a front-page feature describing Thomas's distinguished career and speculating about the mysterious Elena Russo, the librarian with the magic touch. All tickets had sold out, and people were offering to pay triple the price for resales. Thomas spent Friday evening in intense practice, working until nearly midnight. As he was about to go to bed, he heard a gentle knock at his door. When he opened it, Elena stood there in simple pajamas and a robe. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," she said quietly, "but I wanted to say something before tomorrow." Thomas hesitated, then gestured for her to come in. His apartment was spartanly furnished. No personal photographs, just framed reviews and music awards. The only comfortable spot was the piano bench. "I just wanted to say," Elena continued, standing awkwardly in his living room, "that whatever happens tomorrow, I've enjoyed our musical conversation this week." Thomas frowned. "The conversation hasn't really started yet, hasn't it?" Elena smiled. "We've been talking through our practice all week. I've heard your list evolve day by day. It's become more nuanced." Thomas felt a flash of annoyance at her presumption. "My approach is exactly as I intended it to be." "Of course," Elena said, not arguing. "In any case, I hope tomorrow can be about sharing music, not just proving points." As she turned to leave, Thomas was struck by a sudden thought. "Why did you agree to this? You could have simply declined my challenge." Elena paused at the door. "Music has been a private joy for me for a long time. Perhaps it was time to share it again." She looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And perhaps you needed to remember why you began playing in the first place." Before Thomas could respond, she was gone, leaving him with an uncomfortable feeling that she somehow understood him better than he understood himself. Thomas slept poorly that night. His dreams were a jumble of concert halls and faceless audiences. In one particularly vivid moment, he dreamt he was playing to an empty room while, somewhere distant, Elena's music drew away all who might have listened to him. He awoke on Saturday morning with a strange mixture of determination and uncertainty. As he went through his usual pre-performance ritual, a light breakfast, gentle stretching, playing through difficult passages at half-tempo, Thomas found himself thinking not about winning but about what Elena had said. Why had he begun playing in the first place? Before his father's rigid expectations, before the competitions and reviews, there had been a simple joy in making music. When had that slipped away? Thomas pushed the thought aside. Today wasn't about joy, it was about excellence, about standards, about showing everyone the difference between a professional and an amateur. As evening approached, Thomas dressed in his best concert attire. Just before leaving, he paused at his piano and played a few bars of a simple melody, the first piece he had ever learned as a child. Then, squaring his shoulders, he left for the concert hall, not allowing himself to acknowledge the nervous flutter in his stomach that was so foreign to his usual pre-performance confidence. Tonight would settle everything. Burlington's Grand Concert. Hall glowed against the darkening autumn sky. Cars filled the parking lot, and a steady stream of people climbed the steps to the entrance, their excited conversations creating a buzz in the cool evening air. Inside the lobby, a handwritten sign read, "Piano Duel, Thomas Harrington versus Elena Russo, sold out." Thomas arrived through the performer's entrance, nodding to staff members who greeted him. This hall was his territory, a place where he had established his reputation over years of performances. Tonight, however, felt different. Instead of his usual focused calm, he felt a strange tension in his chest. In the green room, Richard was waiting. "Quite a crowd out there," he said, handing Thomas a bottle of water. "I haven't seen the hall this full since the Symphony's gala last year." Thomas took a sip, glancing at the empty chair where Elena would soon sit. "What's everyone expecting, a circus?" Richard chuckled. "They're expecting drama, Thomas. The celebrated virtuoso versus the unknown challenger. It's irresistible." "She's hardly a challenger," Thomas muttered. This was meant to be educational. The door opened and Elena entered, accompanied by Diane. Thomas had expected her to look nervous or out of place in the professional venue, but she appeared remarkably composed. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her hair swept up in a style that was both classical and modern. The only jewelry was her small piano pendant. "The hall is packed," Diane said cheerfully. "We've already raised more for the community center than we did all last year." Elena smiled. "That's wonderful." She turned to Thomas. "Ready for our musical conversation?" Before he could respond, Richard outlined the evening's format. Thomas would play first, followed by Elena. After a brief intermission, they would each perform their second piece. At the end, audience members would place donations in boxes labeled with their names, and the higher total would determine the winner. "It's time," Richard said, checking his watch. "Thomas, you're up." Walking onto the stage, Thomas was momentarily startled by the size of the crowd. Every seat was filled and people were standing in the back. He took his customary bow, settled at the Steinway, and placed his hands on the keys. For a brief second, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. What if I'm wrong? What if technical perfection isn't everything? He pushed the doubt aside and launched into La Campanella. His fingers flew across the keyboard in the dazzling runs and leaps that made the piece famous for its difficulty. Thomas executed each technical challenge flawlessly, his years of training evident in every passage. The audience watched in awe as his hands became a blur of precise movement. As he played the final notes, the hall erupted in enthusiastic applause. Thomas stood and bowed, catching sight of Elena in the wings. Her expression was thoughtful, appreciative even. He felt a flash of satisfaction. Surely now she understood the difference between amateur playing and true virtuosity. When the applause died down, Elena took her place at the piano. Thomas noticed how naturally she sat, adjusting the bench with the confidence of someone completely at home at a keyboard. She took a moment to center herself, then began to play. The piece was Debussy's Clair de Lune, another relatively simple work, Thomas thought at first. But within seconds he realized there was nothing simple about her interpretation. Elena's touch transformed the familiar piece into something Thomas hadn't heard before. She created colors in the sound that made the music shimmer like actual moonlight on water. Each phrase had a natural breath and flow that drew listeners into her musical world. The hall fell completely silent. Thomas found himself leaning forward in his seat off stage, straining to understand how she created that sound, that feeling. Her technique was solid, yes, but there was something more, an understanding of the music's essence that went beyond notes on a page. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment, before the audience burst into applause even more enthusiastic than what Thomas had received. As Elena took a modest bow, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions. Admiration tinged with confusion and, if he was honest, a hint of jealousy. During the intermission, Thomas paced in the green room while Elena sat quietly. "That was a beautiful interpretation of the Debussy," he finally said, needing to break the silence. "Thank you," she replied. "Your list was remarkable. Such clarity in those rapid passages." Thomas studied her face for signs of insincerity but found none. "Where did you study Debussy?" he asked directly. "That wasn't amateur playing." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I told you my path wasn't traditional." Before he could press further, Richard returned to tell them the intermission was ending. For his second piece, Thomas had planned to play the Rachmaninoff with aggressive tempos to showcase his technical prowess. But as he walked back on stage, something made him reconsider. He sat at the piano and, without fully understanding why, decided to take a slightly different approach, still technically brilliant but with more attention to the music's emotional landscape. The audience responded warmly to his performance, and Thomas felt a strange satisfaction different from his usual pride in technical execution. As he returned backstage, Elena smiled at him. "You found the heart of that piece," she said softly. Thomas wanted to respond, but Elena was already walking on stage for her final performance. He stood in the wings, curious despite himself about what she would play. Elena adjusted the bench and then sat completely still for a long moment, her eyes closed. When she opened them, there was a new intensity in her expression that Thomas hadn't seen before. She lifted her hands and began to play. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the hall. Thomas froze. This wasn't a simple piece for amateurs. This was one of the most beloved but challenging works in the piano repertoire, typically performed with a full orchestra, and Elena was playing it with a depth of understanding that showed years of advanced study. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with complete authority. The muscular chords, the sweeping arpeggios, the complex emotional narrative of the piece, all were rendered with masterful control and profound musicality. This wasn't just good playing. This was world-class artistry. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as realization dawned. He had seen this technique before, heard this particular interpretation. 8 years ago at Carnegie Hall. "Elena Petrov," he whispered. Richard appeared beside him. "You didn't know?" he asked quietly. "Elena Petrov," Thomas repeated, stunned. "The Russian pianist who disappeared from the concert stage 10 years ago." Richard nodded. "She retired after a personal tragedy. Her husband and daughter were killed in an accident while traveling to one of her performances. She stopped playing publicly after that, changed her name back to her grandmother's, Russo, and disappeared from the classical music world. On stage, Elena, or rather Elena Petrov, was creating magic. The audience sat transfixed as she shaped the Rachmaninoff with the insight of someone who had lived its emotional journey. Her technique was impeccable, but it was the humanity in her playing that held everyone spellbound. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat as he watched. Elena Petrov had been legendary not just for her technical brilliance, but for her unique ability to connect emotionally with both the music and her audiences. Before she vanished from public life, critics had called her the heart's pianist for her ability to find the emotional core of every piece she played. Now here she was, in Burlington, Vermont, working in a library and living quietly in the apartment below his, and he had challenged her, Elena Petrov, to a piano duel to teach her about real musicianship. As Elena played the concerto's final movement, Thomas experienced the music with new ears. He had performed this piece himself many times, always emphasizing its technical difficulties. But Elena revealed something he had missed: the profound humanity in Rachmaninoff's music, its ability to speak directly to the heart. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. People were wiping away tears, calling brava. Some were simply shaking their heads in wonder. Elena stood and took a modest bow, her eyes glistening. When she looked toward the wings and saw Thomas watching her, something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding. As the applause continued, Thomas did something he had never done before. He walked onto the stage not to take a bow himself, but to stand beside Elena and applaud her. The audience's cheers grew even louder at this unexpected gesture. "Elena Petrov," he said quietly, so only she could hear over the applause. "I've been playing your recording since my student days at Juilliard." She turned to him with a sad smile. That person feels very far away now. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas asked. Would it have mattered? She replied. Music speaks for itself, doesn't it? As they stood side by side on the stage, Thomas realized she had given him a gift far more valuable than he had intended to give her. She had reminded him of what music was for, not to display technical prowess or to prove superiority, but to communicate something deeply human that couldn't be expressed in any other way. The audience continued to applaud, but for Thomas the world had narrowed to this moment of clarity. He had sought to teach a lesson, but had instead been taught one himself. And somehow, as he looked at Elena's face illuminated by the stage lights, he felt not defeat but a strange sense of liberation. The audience's standing ovation continued for nearly 5 minutes. People stomped their feet and called out for encores, but Elena simply stood with a gentle smile, occasionally bowing her head in thanks. Thomas remained beside her, still processing the revelation that had turned his world upside down. Finally, Diane came on stage with the donation boxes. What an extraordinary evening of music, she exclaimed into the microphone. While we count the donations to determine our technical winner, perhaps our pianist would consider an encore, maybe even together. The audience cheered at the suggestion. Thomas looked at Elena, who seemed uncertain. There's a second piano backstage, he said quietly. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. First movement? Elena hesitated, then nodded. As stagehands rolled out the second piano, a buzz of excitement ran through the crowd. The two grand pianos were positioned facing each other. Thomas and Elena sat down, their eyes meeting across the space between their instruments. Without a word or signal, they began to play, finding a shared pulse as naturally as if they had performed together for years. The familiar, haunting melody of the Beethoven emerged, but in their four hands it became something new. Thomas found himself following Elena's subtle shifts in tempo and dynamics, while she responded to his phrasing. The music flowed between them like a conversation, sometimes one voice leading, sometimes the other, but always connected. As they played the final chords, Thomas realized he had never experienced anything like this moment, this pure musical communication with another person. He had spent years perfecting his solitary craft, but had rarely allowed himself the vulnerability of truly playing with someone else. When they finished, the hall was silent for a long moment before erupting once again in thunderous applause. Thomas and Elena stood and bowed together. Richard approached with the final donation count. It's not even close, he whispered to Thomas with a smile. Her box is overflowing. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. When Richard handed him the microphone to announce the results, Thomas made a quick decision. The numbers aren't important, he said to the audience. What matters is that tonight, we've raised over $5,000 for the community center's music room. He paused, then added, and I think we've all been reminded of why music matters in the first place. He handed the microphone to Elena, who looked momentarily startled. Thank you all for coming, she said simply. Music has always been my refuge, and tonight it felt like coming home after a long absence. As the applause finally died down and people began to leave, a small crowd gathered around Elena, many asking if she was indeed the Elena Petrov they had heard years ago. She answered their questions with quiet grace while Thomas stood to the side watching. Eventually, only a handful of people remained in the hall. Diane approached Thomas with a broad smile. Well, that didn't go quite as you expected, did it? No, Thomas admitted. It didn't. She's remarkable, Diane said, looking toward Elena, and so are you when you allow yourself to be. Richard joined them, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. That duet was something special, Thomas. I've never heard you play quite like that before. Thomas nodded, unable to find the right words to express the shift he felt inside. His attention was drawn to Elena, who was speaking with an elderly couple. The woman was wiping away tears as Elena held her hands. Later, as they were preparing to leave, Thomas found Elena alone backstage. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Elena shook her head. You don't owe me anything. I challenged you to prove a point about technical mastery being superior to emotional connection. I was wrong. Both are important, Elena replied. Your technique is extraordinary, Thomas. But technique is a means to an end, not the end itself. Thomas hesitated. Why did you accept my challenge? You could have just told me who you were. Elena's eyes grew distant. After my husband and daughter died, I couldn't bear to play publicly anymore. Music had been our shared joy, and suddenly it was tied to their loss. She touched her piano pendant gently. This was my daughter's. She was just 7. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. I'm sorry. For years I only played for myself in private, she continued. Moving to Burlington was part of starting a new life. When you challenged me, she smiled faintly. I think I needed to discover if I could still share music with others, if it could still bring joy instead of just pain. And did it? Thomas asked. Yes, she said simply. More than I expected. They walked out of the concert hall together into the cool autumn night. A few lingering audience members called out congratulations as they passed. Would you like to get some coffee? Thomas asked impulsively. Or is it too late? Elena checked her watch. There's a cafe on Pine Street that stays open until midnight. They walked mostly in silence, both still processing the evening's events. The cafe was quiet, with just a few patrons reading or working on laptops. They found a corner table and ordered. What happens now? Thomas asked after their drinks arrived. You mean with my identity being revealed? He nodded. Elena wrapped her hands around her mug. I'm not going back to the concert circuit if that's what you're asking. That chapter of my life is closed. She took a sip. But perhaps I don't need to hide anymore either. You could teach, Thomas suggested. There would be a waiting list of students wanting to work with Elena Petrov. She smiled. Actually, I've been thinking about offering free lessons at the community center. For children who couldn't otherwise afford them. Thomas found himself nodding. I could help, he offered, surprising himself. I mean, if you wanted a second teacher. Elena looked at him with gentle amusement. Are you sure you could teach beginners? Children who hit wrong notes and count incorrectly? I could learn, Thomas said, and realized he meant it. Tonight made me think about my father. He pushed me toward perfection from the time I was 6 years old. Music was never about joy for him, it was about achievement. And for you? Thomas considered the question honestly. I don't know anymore. Somewhere along the way, I adopted his view completely. Music became a way to prove my worth. He looked down at his hands. But tonight, when we played together, that felt different. It felt right. They talked for nearly 2 hours about music and teaching, about their different journeys to the piano. Thomas found himself laughing more than he had in years, and speaking more openly than he ever had with a colleague. When they finally walked home, the streets were empty and quiet. At their building, they paused in the lobby. Thank you, Thomas said. For what? For reminding me why I started playing in the first place. Before the competitions and the reviews and the pressure, for showing me what I've been missing, Elena smiled. Music has a way of teaching us what we need to learn. In the weeks that followed, Burlington buzzed with talk of the piano duel and the return of Elena Petrov. Several prestigious conservatories called with teaching offers, which she politely declined. The local paper ran a feature about her plans to teach at the community center. What surprised people most, however, was seeing Thomas Harrington regularly visiting the center as well, working patiently with young beginners. Some afternoons, passers-by would hear laughter and music spilling from the newly renovated music room. Elena and Thomas playing duets with their students, or sometimes just with each other. Thomas's playing changed. Audience members at his next concert hall performance commented on a new depth in his interpretation. Still technically brilliant, but now with something more. Something that reached beyond the notes on the page to touch listeners in a way he never had before. At the community center, a small plaque was installed beside the music room door. It read simply, "Music speaks for itself." When new students asked about the meaning of the plaque, Elena and Thomas would share a smile before explaining that true music happens in the space between technical skill and emotional truth, and in the willingness to listen not just with the ears, but with the heart. On quiet evenings, neighbors in their apartment building would sometimes hear 2 pianos in conversation, one from apartment 3B, one from 4A, each voice distinct but harmonizing perfectly with the other, neither one trying to outshine or overcome, but both creating something together that neither could achieve alone. And Thomas, playing in the privacy of his apartment, finally understood what Elena had known all along, that music isn't a competition to be won, but a conversation to be shared. A conversation that, when honest, can transform both the listener and the player in ways that no technical perfection ever could.